Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive. Got another intense one for you all today,
Yeah,
listeners.
sounds like it.
You guys picked a pretty heavy article for us this week, Ride the Tiger.
Mm-hmm.
So we're going to be grappling with some really big ideas about conservatism, where it's headed,
Yeah,
all that.
definitely.
And luckily, we've got expert speaker here with us
Right here.
whose insights into political theory and social movements, I mean, they're going to be so key as we try to unpack all this.
Happy to be here.
So this article, like I said, it's intense. It really jumps right in,
Yeah.
saying the conservative movement is like straight up facing a major defeat.
Yeah.
They use Trump's loss in 2020 as like Exhibit A,
Yeah.
but then it goes even further,
Mm-hmm.
saying both the left and the right, the whole establishment, really is
Right.
part of this system that the author says is like fundamentally against what they call traditional conservative values. What do you think of that, expert speaker? Like right off the bat.
Well, I mean, the author's not mincing words, right? I mean, it's like they're drawing a line in the sand right from the beginning.
Yeah.
You know, to use a word like hostile to
Hmm.
describe a system that, let's be honest, a lot of people participate in.
Right.
It suggests this feeling of being surrounded by, like, I don't know, by the enemy almost.
It's interesting you say that because the author actually does go on to compare this situation to being at war.
Oh, totally.
Like literally saying anyone who disagrees with what they call the dominant ideology is treated like an enemy combatant.
Yeah, and that's what really struck me too, you know. It makes you think, what does it even mean to be at war with an ideology?
Right.
Like, how does that shape the way we view things like voting or protesting or even just talking about politics?
Especially since the author seems really disillusioned with people like Trump who, you know, at least on the surface,
Right, right.
claim to be fighting against that system.
Oh, yeah, they claim they're fighting the system, but it's like this idea that even those who say they're fighting it are like secretly controlled by it.
Right. Or at least complicit in it.
Exactly. And the author points to things like Trump's pardons, right? They contrast those given to celebrities versus like Assange and Snowden. And just as a reminder for our listeners, those are the guys who leaked classified information about government surveillance programs.
It's
So
a huge deal. Yeah.
exactly, big stuff. So it's like the author's asking, can you really claim to be challenging power if you're not willing to stand up for the people who, you know, expose its secrets?
Like they're saying, put your money where your mouth is, right?
Exactly. And that gets to the heart of what they're saying about true leadership.
Which they illustrate with some pretty heavy historical examples. I mean, the persecution of early Christians, the Romanov family.
Right. It's like a warning almost. Like, if you really want to challenge the established order, history shows it might cost you everything.
And that leads us to this huge question.
Mhm.
If you believe, as the author seems to, that traditional political systems are broken, that they're working against you, and if challenging those systems is so dangerous, what do you do?
Right. Like, where do you even begin?
Because the author doesn't seem to have much faith in the usual solutions. Voting.
Mm-hmm.
Meaningless in a corrupt system, they say. Violent revolution. Counterproductive.
Yeah, they actually make a really interesting point about that. They say that even if, hypothetically, the far left and the far right came together to overthrow the establishment.
Which seems unlikely in itself, right?
Right, exactly. But even if they did, the author argues that the alliance wouldn't last. They actually bring up Hitler's purge of the left within the Nazi Party as an example.
So even if you win, you might end up right back where you started.
Exactly. And that's where I think the author's argument takes a really interesting turn. They shift from this focus on external political battles to something much more internal, much more personal.
Right. It's like they're saying, forget Washington, forget marches. The real revolution starts with you.
Yes. They call for conservatives to focus on personal growth, spiritual development, becoming what they call, and I love this phrase, aristocrats of the soul.
Okay, I have to admit, that one caught my attention too. What do you think the author means by that? Is this about, like, individual morality,
Yeah.
education, something else entirely?
That's where I think we need to dive into the author's mention of this guy, Julius Evola, and his idea of riding the tiger of modernity. I think that might hold the key to understanding this whole aristocrat of the soul thing.
Okay, riding the tiger. I gotta say, that's a pretty evocative image.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I'm not super familiar with this Julius Evola guy. So for those of us who haven't exactly delved into his work, who is he and what's this whole riding the tiger thing all about?
Yeah. Evola can be a bit of a dense read, to put it mildly. But I think at its core, this riding the tiger metaphor, it's about engaging with modernity strategically. And remember how the author sees modernity as this like destructive force, especially when it comes to traditional values.
Right, right. Like this almost unstoppable force.
Exactly. And Navola's saying you can't just like go head to head with it. The author seems to agree with that, by the way. It's more about understanding it, seeing where it's going, what its weaknesses are, and then like using those to your advantage.
Okay, so less about like direct confrontation and more like jujitsu, using the tiger's own momentum against it.
That's a great way to put it. It takes patience, observation, this willingness to play the long game, which is something the author seems to be advocating for as well.
And that makes me think about this whole aristocrat of the soul idea. Is that what they mean? Like cultivating this strong internal foundation so you can survive, maybe even thrive in a world that seems to be, actively hostile to those traditional values.
I think you're really onto something there. It's about building resilience, inner strength, becoming like a beacon of those values in a world that seems to have, lost its way a bit.
But isn't there a danger there? Like if you're too focused on this internal stuff, on becoming an aristocrat of the soul, do you risk like disengaging from the world and becoming irrelevant to the very systems you're trying to change?
Oh, absolutely. That's the tension, right? It's the balance between retreating inward and engaging strategically. And remember, riding the tiger isn't about just giving up, right? It's about choosing your battles, finding those moments where you can actually make a difference.
So it's like finding those pressure points, right? Those moments where you can exert some leverage without like getting completely swallowed up by the system.
Exactly. Think about the author's writing, right? It's not subtle.
Actually not.
They're using strong language, historical examples, even biblical references to like really drive home their message. That's a form of engagement, a very strategic one.
It's interesting you say that because I was thinking about the contrast between their call for, patience, strategy, and then their own language, which is pretty fiery at times. I mean, war,
Yeah.
enemies. They even compare the current political climate to the persecution of early Christians. It's powerful stuff, but it did make me wonder if that kind of rhetoric actually works against their message of, strategic engagement.
It's a paradox for sure. And I think it speaks to that tension a lot of people feel, this sense that everything's at stake, that we have to act now.
It's a feeling that resonates, right? I mean, regardless of your political beliefs, we live in a time where it feels like everything's changing so fast. It's easy to feel overwhelmed, even powerless.
And that's where I think this whole aristocrat of the soul idea becomes really important. It's about finding that grounding, that sense of purpose in a world that feels increasingly chaotic.
So it's not just about, like, waiting for modernity to self-destruct, but about building something better in the meantime.
Exactly. And that something better might start with, personal transformation, cultivating the values that the author is talking about. It's about becoming like a living example of the change you want to see.
Which makes me think about something we haven't really touched on yet. Education. I mean, if we're talking about passing on values, about shaping future generations, where does education fit into all of this?
That's huge, right? And the author doesn't explicitly address it, but I think it's implied in their call to action. Remember, they urge readers to embody the change they want to see. And to me, that suggests a kind of education that goes beyond just, textbooks and lectures.
It's about mentorship, building communities, leading by example.
Exactly. Recognizing that real, lasting change. It often happens through those personal connections, the slow, steady work of building relationships and sharing ideas.
It's a much more organic approach than like trying to win an election or get your message on cable news.
Right. And it speaks to a different way of thinking about power itself, not as something you grab and wield over others, but something that comes from within, from a deep commitment to your values, to the strength of your character. It's about becoming, as the author puts it, an aristocrat of the soul.
It's like they're saying real change doesn't come from shouting from the rooftops, but from cultivating something real inside yourself.
It's a very different way of thinking about social change, right? Not about imposing your will, but about living by your principles even when they're not popular.
Yeah, and it's powerful, but it also makes me wonder, so if we're taking the author seriously, right, if we buy this whole riding the tiger thing, if we accept that the old ways of doing politics are broken, how do we actually make it work? How do we put these ideas into practice in a world that feels like it's going crazy?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And honestly, I don't think there's a simple answer, a one-size-fits-all solution. But I think if we're following the author's lead, it starts with that personal transformation, becoming these aristocrats of the soul.
So like building that inner strength, that unshakable core set of values.
Exactly. It's about developing the character, the intellect, even the spiritual side, to face really tough challenges without losing sight of what you believe.
So you've got to have that internal compass, that sense of purpose, to navigate a world that often feels like it's trying to pull you in a million different directions.
Exactly. And, this might tie back to what we were talking about earlier with education. It's not just about stuffing your head with facts, but about really developing your character, your resilience, your ability to think for yourself.
It's about giving yourself the tools to not just get by, but to really thrive in a world that doesn't always share your values.
And that takes real self-awareness,
Yeah.
You've got to be willing to really look at your own beliefs, your own biases.
Mm.
And you need to commit to growing as a person, which is about way more than just reading a book or scrolling online.
Right. It's about putting those values into action every single day.
Exactly. In everything you do, your relationships, your work, the choices you make.
It's a tall order for sure.
Sure.
But if we're being honest, if we're talking about this tiger of modernity and all the craziness that comes with it, maybe this kind of inner work isn't just for conservatives, right? Maybe it's for anyone who feels like the world's gone a bit mad.
I think you're absolutely right. On the surface, this article is about a certain political ideology, but that message of personal transformation, of finding your own strength in a world that often feels overwhelming, that's something we all connect with as human beings.
It's that feeling of wanting to find your place in the world to make a difference, even when it feels like everything's stacked against you.
It's a powerful reminder that even when it feels like everything's spinning out of control, we still have a choice in how we respond to the challenges in front of us.
Yeah, we have the power to choose, to build ourselves up, to stay true to what we believe in, and to work towards something better.
And that's something worth fighting for, no matter what side of the aisle you're on.
Couldn't agree more, expert speaker. This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive, and I have a feeling we've only just scratched the surface here.
There's definitely a lot more to explore, and I hope our listeners will continue this conversation with us.
Absolutely. So to everyone listening, we want to hear from you. What resonated with you in this episode? What questions are still swirling around in your head? Head over to our social media pages, and let's keep this conversation going.
Looking forward to hearing what y'all have to say.
Until next time, happy diving, everyone.